Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Interviewing Wednesday. We're very glad you're with us today. It's September 22nd, the first day of fall 2021. For those people on Zoom, if you have questions throughout the meeting, please just enter your questions into the Zoom chat window. For those watching on Facebook, you're welcome to enter your questions into the comment field. I am monitoring that feed. Please note this event is being recorded and is currently live on Facebook. The recording will be on the Career DFW Facebook page and the Career USA YouTube channel for others to view in the future. By participating in this event, you give consent for your name and picture to appear. Please note that any comments you put in the Zoom chat window do not appear in the recording. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeff Morris. Back in 2008, I started a website called careerdfw.org to help those who are unemployed in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. In 2012, I started a second website, careerusa.org. I've written a book called What I've Learned About Your Job Search That You May Not Know. It's available on Amazon. Since 2007, I've been facilitating and leading the North Dallas Plano Career Focus Group. The group's been around since the late 1990s, and I'll tell you about our upcoming program at the end of this session. And since 2017, I've been a member of the practice interview team, and you'll hear more about that in just a second. Well, when we started this 18 months ago, I asked Mark McDonald, who leads the practice interview team, and Walt Glass, who leads the interview success workshop, to put their heads together and come up with something to tell us about interviewing on Wednesdays. And who knew that it would be 13 sessions over 20 hours of material. So we're going through these sessions every week to try to help you with your interviewing skills. So today's presentation is recorded. It is edited and it's recorded from the last time that they did this. So we'll answer all your questions at the very, very end of the presentation. So let me go ahead and start this up.
Career in the telecommunications equipment industry. It's now called IT infrastructure. And it was a great career for the first 20 years or so. And then the recession in 2001 happened, and that really affected my industry much bigger than everybody else. I mean, after the recession was over, my industry kept declining. And so I was laid off 3 times between 2002 and 2012. And that was kind of the end of my career in telecommunications equipment. I then took a bridge job and then officially retired in May of 2018. So I've been down the path that many of you are on right now, and I apply all of that experience to my leadership of the practice interview team. So the practice interview team does just what it says it does. We offer you practice interviews. They're panel interviews. There's usually 3 interviewers. All the interviewers have been hiring managers, so we're professionals at selecting people to come to work for our companies. It's a very customized and personalized interview experience because you provide your resume and the job description. Okay, so it's not a generic thing at all. We give you a interview specifically focused on the job description that you provide and the background from your resume. So those interviews take about 45 minutes. The whole interview session, introduction, and questions and answers at the end takes about 1 hour and 15 minutes. And if you'd like to sign up for a practice interview, all you have to do is send an email to dallaspitcrew@gmail.com, and we'll go to work setting up practice interview. We use the Zoom technology. We do the interviews Monday through Friday on regular business hours. I'll need a couple of days to 2 to 3 days to set up your interview. That's 2 to 3 business days. And so when you send in your information, also include when you're available, +2 and +3 days. So about 85% of the time, the majority of the time, we can get those interviews set up in 2 days, but sometimes it takes 3 to get everybody's schedules lined up. So that's the Pit Crew. My slogan is practice early, practice often. So every time you practice, you're going to do better in your real interviews. And just consider how much time you spend on your resume and on your LinkedIn profile versus how much time you spent practicing. Because when you get in a stressful interview situation, what comes out of your mouth is often not what you thought you were going to say, and sometimes it can torpedo your results. So come and build your confidence and practice asking questions and building rapport and answering the questions that the interviewers throw at you. It's a great experience. And of course, as I mentioned, I don't think, maybe I didn't mention, I personally have had, been laid off 3 times, but everyone on the pit crew has had an experience with job transition. Many of them are currently in job transition. So it's a very empathetic group, trying to shorten your job search as much as we can. Now, what else you got for me, Jeff? The pit crew also does one-way interviews. There we go. So this is a bit different, but it's if you've had a one-way interview, then you'll know what I'm saying. It's a very different experience. Now, I'm sitting here in my home office talking to a computer basically, but I can see you guys on the other end. I can see your reactions. And of course, you're going to ask questions and things like that. But when you are talking to a computer, when nobody's on the other end, it's really a very different, surreal experience. So we have an opportunity for you to practice doing that with a tool, a professional tool that companies use. The name of the tool is called Easy Hire. Jeff arranged for it to be donated to us. And I'll give you the questions in advance and then a link, and you engage the tool. And so the 4 questions will be asked. You'll get a chance to answer them. You get 3 minutes for each answer. Once you're done, you'll get a link. And so you can go and look at your interview. I will never see it. Nobody really needs to touch anything once we get the process started. If you want to share that link with other people, you can, but that's up to you. If you want to share it with a coach, if you want to get some feedback from somebody in the pit crew, we can arrange for that. But otherwise, it's just a chance for you to practice this, interesting and I would say challenging tool, a one-way interview.
Mark, you're on live.
Mute me. Okay, so a guest appearance. No, I wanted to mention one other thing, and I've had quite a few landings in my group of volunteers over the summertime, and so now I've reached a point where I need to kind of build up the size of the volunteer group, and so I'm looking for people who have been hiring managers as part of their professional responsibility. That's the only thing that the pit crew requires for you to become a volunteer. So you use that experience that you've had from your professional work to be an interviewer. It doesn't matter what industry you've worked in, and I do try to keep a very large number, around 30 volunteers available. So you don't have to volunteer every week. There's really no obligation to spend a certain amount of time on interviews. When you see a candidate that looks good to you, then you have an opportunity to volunteer. So if you have some time, and maybe you do if you're in between jobs in the job search, I've got a great opportunity for you to give back to the community of job seekers. And I think you'll find as well that it improves your interviewing the more you practice being a panelist. So reach out to me, dallaspitcrew@gmail.com, and I'll tell you how to get involved. If you have any more questions, I can answer those questions for you. And please consider this as an opportunity to give back to your community. And yeah, I'd like to add you to the team. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark.
And then finally, I do one other thing besides leading the pit crew related to job search. I coach on the question, why did you leave your last job? So if you've got a difficult situation in your past that causes you some angst and anxiety, something you can't get through with confidence and brevity, then let's have a conversation, and we'll storyboard how to answer the question, why did you leave your last position, or why did you leave this position back in 2016? But also storyboard any follow-up questions that your situation may generate. So I try to give you a comprehensive approach to how to answer this question so you can be confident. And the fact is if you answer that question very confidently, there won't be any follow-up questions. They'll be moving on to discuss how you can help them, as opposed to, why did you leave this job 4 or 5 years ago?
Walt Glass here, and I'm an interview success coach. So what do I do? Well, I have a very informal learning interview success workshop. What do we focus on? We're going to focus on fundamentals. We're going to focus on what do we need to prepare prior to an interview. We've got some sessions on exactly that. Number one, and there's another one that goes more in detail for preparing generically and then preparing specifically. But the workshop practices the 11 basic categories of questions, their motives, options, strategies, structures, ways we might answer them depending on who's asking, what the question is, and where you are in the process. So it's a very informal. You will get a video of the interview. They average about 15 to 17 minutes. It's not long. And we'll go through and talk about how we can improve. And I'll give you some suggestions to really differentiate yourselves from those other candidates and how we go through that. So what do you need to prepare? Nothing, just come as you are. You can start from scratch. People tell me they're not ready yet. And I said, well, what's your plan to get ready? And there's a long pause. And so we'll come to the workshop. I will help you prepare a plan to get ready for a successful interview. Now do it very informally. It's not a mock interview. It's a learning interview. It's a time to sit down and learn. There's no need to squirm, no need to be stressful, no need to have to worry about making a mistake, because we don't make mistakes. We're just improving ourselves. That's all we're trying to do. Look at my LinkedIn page. The about section tells you all about the workshop, gives you that Yahoo email address to email me and say, when do you have some availability? I do it on Tuesdays, 10 to 12. And if more people sign up, then I schedule some additional workshops. I also have the easy hire. And so if you want to come practice or start learning the 11 basic questions, you want to practice those, you can do that with all the same things that Mark said also works for my section of practicing the 11 questions. So I'd be glad to have you come on down. It's not one of these things that you got to worry about. We just come have a good time and learn how to improve ourselves. There's no need to have stress. We can have learning without squirming.
Walt, thank you very, very much. All right, well, today is session number 8 of 13, asking questions in the interview. So gentlemen, take it away.
Okay, here, let's talk a little bit about put this into context. And today's session is all about asking questions during the interview. It's a very effective way to turn an interview from an interrogation into a conversation or dialogue. It can be used to build rapport, which we'll talk about in a separate session as well, how to, kind of questions you want to ask specifically. I think we mentioned them briefly this time, but it's such a powerful tool, and so few people do it, as far as I can tell. Now, in the pit crew, it's a little bit of a different situation because we're not really the team, so I have to believe that people ask questions during their real interviews more than they ask questions at the pit crew, but I'm not that confident that that's true. If you practice what actually happens in an interview, then you're not asking enough questions during the interview. You're just waiting till the interviewer gives you permission, and that's probably too late in the process. But let me back up for a second and say, here are the 13 sessions. And we are on session number 8 right now, asking questions. So if you look at the 13 sessions, and these are all available on the Career USA YouTube channel. So if there's a topic here that you really need to work on, then you can go look at the sessions that Walt and I did in January, February, and March. It's the same titles, the same information that's on this round, and you can look at that specific topic. So the way this is structured is the first 5 are all about preparing to interview. So if you're new to the job search, you want to focus on those 5. The second 5 are about effective interviewing, and we're right in the middle of that group of 5, asking questions. And then the last 3 are some special topics that build upon all the previous knowledge: target companies, informational interviewing, networking, and then how to deal with difficult interviewers and their questions, and avoiding interview crashes or avoiding the mistakes that people commonly make. Even though they're aware of them, they still make them. So we'll go over specifically what those mistakes are and how to avoid them in the very last session.
Well, here we go. In the interview, we really focused on answering questions, and now you tell me I got to ask questions too? I mean, my goodness. It's hard enough just answering. Why have I got to ask them? So why don't we talk a little bit about why we should ask questions? First of all, it's a two-way street. We would like to find out if we want to work there. So let's learn and confirm that there is a fit for the job, the company, the culture, the team, and the value, the achievements that we can bring, the things that we can help them do. So that would be one of the top things we do, because we should prepare a list that says, I want to find these things out. And so I'll have a list of questions, because that's important to us to figure out if it's a great place. And also it creates a conversation. Now, creating a conversation is really good because we can find out that information. But when you're going back and forth, it really reduces the stress and anxiety and pressure. And all, you're just under the gun answering question after question after question. And here you kind of relax and talk about things. And so that helps quite a bit and gets you into that conversational mode. And it engages the interviewer. So how much should we talk? And they talk? Well, about 70% for us and about 30% for them, somewhere in that area. So you don't want to take over the interview and always want to stay on their agenda. It also demonstrates our breadth of knowledge and research. So we don't just ask questions to find out information. We lead questions with knowledge, saying, I saw this, and then I have a question about that, which demonstrates our research and the amount of effort and work that we've done to prepare for this interview. It really stands out as a strong differentiator. And it shows interest, enthusiasm, and builds rapport. We'll see a little bit about that. And it separates us from other candidates in a positive way. Not too many candidates ask questions. Mark really said, there's not a lot of people that ask questions. And so every time I give a practice interview, and we're recording it and going through the process, I say, now, we're not going to answer any questions here, because waking up responses is not going to add to the purpose of what we're doing in the practice interview. But I would encourage you to ask questions. You get extra credit for asking questions as you go through, and then nobody asks a single question. And it just doesn't happen. And it's something mental that's just stopping us from doing that. So George Wright, I was fishing around the internet and they had an interview with George. And so I cut out several of the comments that he made for various presentations. And he's right on track with what Mark and I talk about in interviewing. So what he says is, I asked to have any questions. So I asked this question because I want to see two things: how insightful they are. That means how much work we've done, research we've done, knowledge we have to see that what's going on, what's happening, and learn what's important to them. So when I ask questions, they are actually going to judge me by the questions that I ask. So it would be great if at the end of the interviewer says, you ask good questions. What's the definition of a good question? It means you're finding out the kind of information that you need to find out in order to make a good fit. And so we can control some things and do something with our questions as well and still stay on their agenda. So let's talk about guidelines in general about questions. So just to say, all right, what kind of questions? How should we treat this subject? Number one, prepare your prioritized list. We may not get to ask all our questions, so let's make sure the ones we do get to ask are at the top of the list. So we can find out what's the most important thing that you want to find out. Top 3, 4, or 5. So you research the job, the company, the people, the industry, competition, current news, everything that you can to help you gain knowledge about what's happening, what's going on in that industry, what's happening, what's going on in that company, what their culture is like. And you can include your areas where we demonstrate who we are, what we do, and how we help. The 3 pillars of what companies are buying. For example, a person was asking a question, and he said, I was looking at your 10K. They were a public company. And in section 5, the management discussion and analysis, it says this. Another person said, and had a question about it. Another person, I was listening to your quarterly report earnings announcement, and your CEO was saying, what we need to do is to develop more products with a higher margin. The question was, what is it that the company's doing in order to achieve that specific objective? Now, why ask that question? Because this person is in product development. I can help you achieve that objective. So certain questions are going to be around the areas that we can help them. So like you take your achievements list, which build your old star stories, that's a whole nother topic in another session. But when we ask questions about those areas that they're having, what's going on, what's happening, what's the world like, then we can say, well, would you like me to tell you about a time when and then you give an R to address that specific problem. So you should have questions that lead into your star stories that's relevant to the position. Now, it's not really difficult to do, but it takes a while to prepare and do that. The hard part is the research part and doing the work to prepare. The easy part is getting inside, then having the questions and having that conversation going back and forth. Avoid the me questions. I put ourselves ahead of the employer because, you know, I'm more interested in me than I am you, salary, health insurance, benefits, vacation, working hours, training, etc. Now, I know that Mark says, you know, we ought to bring up salaries somewhere in the process, which is not a bad idea. Sometimes it might be better that we bring it up first before they bring it up. But somewhere, depending on who you're talking to and how many interviews you've had in the process, you may want to bring up the salary question at a point in time to say, you know, we've gone far enough. Now it looks like everything's good, but I don't know if the salary's right. Now's the time to find out, because just like them, they don't want to go any further if the salary is not a match. And we got a whole nother session on salary stuff. One at a time, no double questions. You ever had a person ask a double question and you can't remember the other question, or you just ignore it? Or you ask them two questions at once and they don't remember the second question? I do this occasionally in the practice interview. I'll ask two questions. And when a person remembers the second question and answers them both, I am very impressed. That meant they are listening, they're paying attention. I mean, it's really is a strong differentiator. But we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't do that to them because they probably won't answer one of them. Just go one at a time. Try your open-ended questions. Now, closed-ended questions, you know, are for clarification. Did you say 25? Did you say 15? Did you say 50? You know, whatever it might be, to make sure. Not questions for clarifying the question that they asked us. So that's okay. But when you're trying to get out information, for example, I suggest you don't say, why is this position open? Is it because somebody left, or is it a new position, or, you know, and we start giving them a multiple choice answer. Why don't you just ask them, why is this position open, and just leave it at that? And they can tell you why it's open. Multiple topics. Don't ask just questions in one area. Ask in multiple areas: the job, the company, product, services, future plans, objectives, industry, competition, etc. All right. And that demonstrates our genuine interest across multiple aspects of the company. So we're really finding out things, not just stuff in our area, not just the generic. You know, we hear, I'm sure Mark would agree, that some of the questions we hear are probably repeated. There's only about 5 or 6 questions. We hear them all the time. You don't hear much outside those range of 5 or 6 questions. So we got to prepare something across the chain, and you want to, in your priority, you want to kind of spread that mix in your priority questions so that you're covering more than just one area. Personalize your questions. Could you share the reasons why you joined the company? You know, who, what, where, when are great. How can be also good if you're looking for specifics, but we want to discard why. Why is an interrogation question. Why did you do this? It's like Dragnet, if you remember Dragnet. I just think, you know, just being in an interrogation room and why did you do this? Why did you do that? Try to drop why is just not a very good way to ask a question. How would you define the expectations? I see some information in the job description, but I'm interested in how would you define the expectations? Can you tell me a little bit about your career since joining the company? Those personalized questions. I know Mark likes that too. Don't wait until the end of the interview, right? Do you want to hear about a time when I gave this? Now, why would you start doing that? So if they're not asking you questions where you can tell your stories or you can demonstrate your expertise, pick a topic that they, or whenever they're talking about some particular topic, within that topic, you might bring up. So, well, I've had an experience doing something like that. Would you like to hear about a time when I did this? Okay. And you give that that achievement, that result. And then they can choose whether they want to hear the story or not. But if you're not telling them, try to tell some by asking them relevant questions in the process around the topic that's under discussion. Always have questions when they ask if we have any questions. All right. So I was talking with a person, and he's been interviewing several, and in his interview chain, he's in distribution, warehouse management, all that sort of thing. And so he interviews with the CEO, but he's interviewed with, I don't know, 6 or 8 people prior to getting to the CEO. So the CEO said, well, do you have any questions for me? He said, no, I think I've got pretty much everything, meaning I've learned all that information from all the other people. Now, you be the CEO. How would you feel if the candidate said, no, I don't have any questions? Wouldn't you like to know the CEO's perspective on things? Wouldn't you like to know that? Wouldn't you like to know those sort of things? And so that was a negative. And I feel like that's one of the reasons that he did not get hired at a couple of opportunities, because he did not have questions. And so we talked about it. And he said, I'm going to ask questions in the future. Make sure I do. Now, let's talk about dealing with recruiters. So there's a couple of areas about recruiters I'd like to cover here. So one of the things is, let's find out about our recruiters. So I'll call it due diligence on recruiters. Some people say, what was in my resume that interested you? That's not a bad question if that was the device or that was the information that they had. But if you leave it wide open, you can say, what information do you have that interested you in contacting me? All right. There may be something besides something in the resume. They may mention 2 or 3 things that occurred. They may mention a referral. They may mention that somebody knows you, and you can get all those answers just by opening up that question a little bit. What information do you have? Who are you? Are you a company recruiter? Are you contingency? Are you retained? Contingencies only get paid by placing people there. Are you retained? Are you the recruiting process outsourcing organization of Toyota? When they were hiring so many people when they moved here, brought in a whole slew of recruiters that they really was outsourced to hire all the people. I think they were trying to hire like 3,000 people, something like that, back a couple of summers ago. Who do you represent? I mean, what company is it? Recruiters sometimes try to keep everything close to the vest, and they don't want to tell you. They don't want them to go around you. That's the motive behind the question. So who do you represent? If you can get that information, great. Okay, well, can you, if they can't give you the specific, can you tell me what kind of company? Can you give me any information whatsoever? Right? Can you give me a job description? So what is their job specialty? Recruiters generally specialize in different job areas. Are they a specific person handling this type? And if they're not, then you say, well, do you know anyone in your area or someone else in your company or someone else in your recruiting firm that does handle this specific area? And where are you in the search process? So in general, they start out researching the position candidates. Do they do screening? Then they present, the company makes a selection. And if it takes kind of a long time, I would say if you put months in the word phase, was one of the changes, Mark. If you put months in there, something's going on, something's happening. Recruiters can't tell you a lot of information about what's going on and what's happening. They are kind of limited based on the information from the company that they can share. Have you placed anyone in the company before? What a great question. Tell me about that company. What's their process? What's going on? Do you have a job description? So now we're talking about the position in the company. What do you know about the job, the company, the culture, leadership? What's their style? What's their hiring? What's their hiring process? I mean, how many interviews do they have? What kind of people are we talking to? Whatever information you can get. What are the qualifications of the ideal candidate? Now, some recruiters are simply what I would say basic searching for qualifications only. They don't know anything about the company, don't know anything about the job. They just have a list of questions. They call you up, they ask you questions, they copy down, report answers, and have somebody else make the decision. But then you have those who are very, very informative about the information. They work with the companies. that sort of thing. Find out that kind of stuff. That can really help you depend on where you want to go with getting help from a recruiter. Remember, recruiters are not out there to find a job for us. If you ever have that thought in your mind that you're going to tell a recruiter, here's my resume, here's what I'm looking for, and you think they're going to call back and give you potential job opportunities, that's not going to happen. That's extremely rare. So remember that about their job. Opening questions. So you get into the opening, and I suggest that we ask a couple of questions. These are probably some of the most important ones because since we're in a selling situation, we want to find out what they're buying. So here's a phrase. So you answer this first question and you say, now that I've told you something about myself, a little transition, and you ask one of these two questions. One of them is, how can I help you? Anything that's along the lines of how can I help you? How will my performance be measured? What's the criteria in the performance appraisal? What are the specifics that I can do for you to say I've done an outstanding job in some time frame? Followed up by, okay, I've got those. Which ones are the most important? Which ones should I pay attention to first? And you get that answer, and then you say, okay, well, which one of those would you like to talk about first? And you can get into the discussion of all the areas that you can help them with. Very, very good way to do it. Soon thereafter, I think second, third, you don't ask the double question and say, what's the most important characteristics? What is it that a person has to do in this role to be successful in this role? So how can I help you? And who are you looking for? So how can I help you is the I help. Who you're looking for is the I am. What kind of person are you looking at? What kind? So you can measure culture fit, those kind of things. Closing questions. Now, there's a whole series of things in a close. I'm just picking out the questions part of the close, not the whole close. That's, again, another session in openings and closings. So how would you compare me to the ideal candidate? Why wouldn't we want to ask, how do I compare to other candidates? You're the interviewer, and I ask you, how would I compare to other candidates? Are you going to tell me? Are you going to go ahead and say, well, we haven't interviewed everybody and we don't know? I mean, you're going to get blown off. I mean, they're not ready to answer that question, nor do you care in one sense, because you care about being the ideal candidate. And you're sending a message that says, I want to be the top candidate here, right? And if there's any gaps, maybe we get a chance to say, well, can we talk about those, see if we can remove any concerns. Find out the process for hiring from the get-go and update it as you go along. A series of interviews, who with, who's the decision maker. You know that sometimes the hiring manager is not the decision maker. HR makes the decision. HR determines the salary. It's not the hiring manager. But find out what you can find. Because many people say, I don't know when to call them back. Well, when you look at the next step, where you go to the next, who'll contact me and the follow-up. So if we're having this conversation and I said, all right, what happens next? Well, I hear back from this interview, and who will that be? And when should I expect to hear from them? And if I don't hear from them by that time, is it okay if I contact them and name the next business day? All right. Then you know when to call back. If you get a message when you call back, you do the same thing again. Give them a compliment, tell them something specific about what you liked in the interview, something different. And then say, and if I don't hear from you by this date, I'm going to call you again. All right. That way you can control your job search, not just interview, answer, hope they choose you. Who do I call if I have questions? You always want to have questions later, because that's the way you can stay top of mind, stay in touch. That's just a simple thing here, but there's an art to the thing that you would put in an email or a phone call, as to just, because you don't just call, so yeah, I have another question, here's the question. There's other things besides that. You want to build a little rapport, talk about the past, talk about maybe the future, talk about the excitement that you have, etc. Then you ask the question. And then the very next step. What is the next step? Now, I get that question a lot from people. What is the next step? But we got to get more than just what is the next step. We want to find out when it should be, where will it be, who will it be with. Update that information as you go along. They may not know until an interview is scheduled. When it's scheduled, you want to try to find out names of the people, the roles that they play, because we want to look them up. We might find out that they went to the same school that we did, something in common. Find out who you're talking to. Now, there's a document that I have that I'm going to drop in the chat window in a few minutes. And it's called 200 Questions Job Candidates May Ask Your Company. Now, you can search on that, look it up, but I will drop it in. But it's written a little differently. It's written to the interviewers saying, these are the kind of questions you need to be prepared to answer. Now, you can look up only about 1 million different questions that you can ask out on the internet. Questions you should ask, the top 14, the top 10, the top 24. There's a whole slew of them that are out there. And we're going to send you a couple of documents, including one that Mark's going to drop in the chat as well. This one's kind of interesting, and you can see the topics that are covered here that I'll put questions stars may ask. Well, that's kind of cool. I wonder what those are, because I'd like to be a star. So I'll drop that into the chat window a little bit later. So when we ask questions, we want to determine that they are finding who we are, finding what we do, and finding how we can help them so that we're selling. Now, we have to find out from them so that we can match it using the job description and our questions to help discern that type of information so we can demonstrate it. So we should have questions to demonstrate our interest in the position and the company. All right, so you ask questions about both. Show our drive to excel and the fact that we've done a lot of pertinent research. Strong differentiators. Take it away, Mark.
Now, I've got a little bit to add to what Walt was talking about, and here we go. So Walt talked about asking questions at the beginning of the interview. It's part of what I call in the PIT group, getting a good start. So I have listed my favorite questions there to ask. Right after you get to make your opening statement, which you will most of the time, 2/3 of the time at least, is when you should start asking these questions. And they'll come up later in the interview if you're asked a challenging question. And so I'm going to go over a few of the challenging questions out of the 64 toughest questions that interviewers ask. And that's my document that I distribute to, well, I mean, it's not mine, it's the document I like the most, that so much so that I distribute to every candidate in the PIT group. You know, take a look at this document, and we'll go over a few of what I think are some of the best challenging questions and how to answer them. I'm also going to talk a bit about how you ask a question. So there's lots of questions you can look up. It's important how you ask them, and I was curious about this, direct versus indirect questions, because I'm a very direct, I would say, person. It's part of my personality. But asking indirect questions is much more effective in an interview situation. So we'll talk about that and the differences and different ways you can ask an indirect question. And then I already mentioned using effective questioning to respond to difficult interview questions. And then one slide on panel interviews and neutral questions for panel interviews. So that's what I'm going to cover in the next 10, 15 minutes. Okay, so job descriptions are generally not reliable. You know, we have a whole session on job descriptions, a whole presentation on those, and in general, they may not be new. They probably were not written by the current hiring manager. In big companies, they're difficult documents to get changed, so they don't get changed. And so one of the key things you want to do very early in the process is verify that what's in the job description is an accurate and current representation of their priorities. Now, the job description was a very timely document at some point, okay? And that might have been a few months ago, or it might have been a few years ago. So I think you can trust the document, but what you're trying to sort out is what are the most important priorities right now for this hiring manager or for this group of interviewers, right? So it's a question you can ask any interviewer. And here we go. I think Walt already gave you this one. What can I do for you in the next 6 to 9 months? Just for you to say that I've done an outstanding job. Now, what I like about asking the question this way is you've included the phrase outstanding job, okay? So you definitely want to do an outstanding job. So now you're asking, what would I have done, or what do I need to do an outstanding job? And then you want to ask in every case, however you decide to pursue this topic, your opening, and the questions right after your opening statement, you want to ask follow-on questions. Okay, so this is not a one and done series of events. Now, and I talk about this in openings and closings the other session, but let me mention it here. It may become a little bit awkward, because you're in some sense taking over the interview, right? So you may want to ask permission. You may want to say, well, could I ask you a couple of questions? Or you may want to ask a very indirect question, which I'll talk about in the next slide. I'm really curious to know, of those that you listed, which do you want me to pay attention to first, or to help you with first? Okay, so but 2 or 3 questions here to sort out what their most important priorities are. And some people may try to put this off to say, well, I don't know, they just asked me to interview you. The hiring manager can tell you what the priorities are. And, then you can say, well, you're interviewing me for a purpose, and I'd like to know what your perspective is on, what it takes to be a big contributor here. So you can personalize those questions to draw out people's personalized response, because obviously they're going to give an assessment of your candidacy, whether they're the hiring manager or not. And so you want to find out what they think is important, so you can address it. I was wondering, so this is another way to ask an indirect question. I was wondering if you could tell me more about the most important priorities of this position. That's a good question. And, then the follow-on questions. In addition to that, what else? Is there anything else do you see that's essential to success in this position? Just another ways to phrase these questions. And I'm curious to hear, what was it about my background that interested you the most? Okay, this is a good question to ask your recruiter when they call you. Now, Walt generalizes this even more, and let's just talk briefly about open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are really good questions. Okay, you'll get asked open-ended questions in your interview because you get to pick how the question is answered. And so you want to ask the interviewers the same kind of deal, the same kinds of questions, so they can take the answer in the direction that's important to them. And so it's important how they answer that question. Now, Walt's version of this question is, I'm curious to hear, what have you learned about me, or what information do you have about me that interests you the most? So that's even more general. I ask about my background. What was it about my background? But they may, most interesting thing may be them is you got referred by the president of the company. So, that's a much more general question, and you can gain more information, possibly by asking an even more open-ended question. But this is a good one to ask recruiters, and they may tell you that you were referred by somebody else. The Walt's version is good too. A few things to avoid. In general, it's not a good idea to divert the start of the interview to get your questions answered. So here's a problem with the document I'm going to share with you, the 64 toughest questions. They recommend that when the interviewer asks you to make your opening statement, you suggest that, if they just answered a few questions first, you could be much more focused in this interview. And that's answering a question with a question. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that in Texas. I don't know where else you might want to do it. Maybe the East Coast is, more amenable to those kinds of, but here it's considered rude. Here it's just considered rude. So you answer the question. And this means your opening statement is going to be, I already covered this, but let me repeat it. This means your opening statement will be based on your research, okay? And then your first few questions will seek to update or prioritize that information, okay? So they're going to say, tell me about yourself, or let's go over your background, or let's review your resume. Don't review your resume. Make your opening statement. this is who I am. This is how I can help you. This is why I'm motivated to come to work here. We have that's covered in opens and closings and follow up on how to make that opening statement. And then you start asking your clarifying questions, okay? And you may even ask permission, depending on how formal you think the interviewer is. You may even ask permission to ask those questions before you start asking those questions. And then there's going to be, 2 or 3 to sort out what their most important priority is, what it takes to be a successful candidate in this role, and anything else that's important, right? Yeah, now I say that, I got to give you a caveat, because in a couple of slides, I'm going to, talk about ways to divert an inappropriate question or a difficult question with a question. Okay, but in general, it's not a good idea to answer a question with a question. And don't ask questions about things you can find on their website or that a recruiter can answer, okay? So don't show up at the interview missing your opportunities to query the recruiter, okay, which Walt talked about, or missing your opportunity to do research. You just, how awkward can it be if you ask a question and they say, well, that's on the first page of our website, and that's the answer, So don't do that. You want to ask insightful questions. You want to do enough research that you can ask insightful questions. Okay, let's talk about direct versus indirect questions. And there's some time where you want to ask a direct question. Sometimes you want to ask just a yes or no question. And so I cover that in the best way to do that. Indirect questions, which is sometimes called a question in a question, is a more formal and polite way to ask for information or make a request. And you probably do this naturally anyway when you're asking something of a stranger or people you do not know well, and including your coworkers who you may not be friends with. And so they go something like this. Can you tell me what are the most important priorities of this position? Do you know? Do you know if? Do you know whether? That's for a yes, no question. Do you know if you'll be able to give me an answer by next Monday? Okay, that's a yes or a no question. It's a closed-ended question, but if there's some deadline, they may say, well, why do you ask, right? After you ask them, you say, well, Monday, I have to respond to this offer I have. And so, you kind of need to make your decision by then, or I'm off the market, So do you know if, do you know whether, for yes, no questions? Would you mind sharing with me what's your overtime policy? Okay. Do you have any idea? Would it be possible? So these are questions in a question. They're ways to lead into your question. They're, like I said, they're a little more formal than just asking the, can I start on Thursday? A direct question, which is a yes, no answer. I was wondering, and I was curious to know or hear or understand. I really like these because the curiosity is a valued characteristic. So, and people, one time we had a candidate come through the picture. This is where I learned this, and several times during the interview, she asked this, I'm curious to understand, or I'm curious to know. And I thought it was a very effective way to ask in a question. So if you can throw in, I'm curious to know this, that, or the other thing, or hear or understand, how this role is important to the company, you can phrase the question. But that's a good lead in, I'm curious to know, and you can use, it's a good lead in question for right at the beginning as well. So. Now, here's one that you don't want to use, and sometimes you might use this with your friends. Is there a chance? Is there a chance that you could take me to the airport on Tuesday? And by the way, we're leaving at 5 a.m. So you don't want to use that really. It's a little too informal, even though a question in a question is a more formal way to ask question. This one is not a good, is there a chance that you'll make a decision by next Thursday? So that's really not the way to answer that question, to ask that question. Okay, let's talk about some challenging questions. And when I'm done here, I'll post up this document And there's the link to it. You know, you guys can do a screen capture real quick if you want to beat me to it, but I'm also going to post it up. How to answer the 64 toughest interview questions. And as far as I can tell, this document's been around for a long time. There's no copyright mark on it. There's no attribution to who generated it, but it's a pretty helpful document. So here's one. The very first question in that document is, how do you answer, tell me about yourself? So tell me about yourself, and then followed immediately by questions seeking to understand their most important priorities. So this is, you know, we've talked about this one extensively. Very important. I can't say enough about how important it is to start asking those questions right up front. Now, the fatal flaw question. Now, I put this one on here on this page because if you ask those questions, you know, what's the most important thing for this position? What are the top characteristics of top performers in this role? You know, how can I help you the most? You're going to be able to deal with some of these more difficult questions that may come up. Like, you know, it says in our job description that we need a master's degree, and you don't have a master's degree. Now, this may be all right with the hiring manager because the hiring manager has invited you in to interview, but it may not be all right with anyone else in the organization. And so now they're going to want to hear, you know, you don't have, I don't know why Joe brought you in here. You don't have a master's degree. Okay, so now instead of saying, you know, whatever you're going to say, you're going to go right to the most important priorities. Okay, match your qualifications to the most important priorities. Now there's a little bit more to it, and I want you to read the document. Go to question 18. You know, part of it is you can say, you know, I've worked extra hard to with other people who have master's qualified. I understand what it takes, and I've been successful, you know, despite not having the degree. I have experience and abilities equivalent, right? So it's, the answer is a little bit longer than this, but it's going to be informed by asking these first few questions right up front. What are the most important priorities? That'll make answering this question a lot easier. Okay, what changes would you make if you came on board? Now, occasionally you get asked this question, and I think it's more of a probing question, you know, kind of to figure out how you think. And some interviewers will be curious about how you think. So you're going to be much more able to answer that question if you know what their top priorities are, and if you may have asked them up front, you know, what are some of the big challenges that you believe I can help with? What was in my background where you think I can make the biggest impact? Okay, that's a good way to sort out if they've got some particular challenge that they're trying to solve. If you just ask the direct question, you know, what are your challenges, you know, or what, you know, it's basically asking them what's going on wrong, you know, or what's difficult for you. I don't think most interviewers, I know I wouldn't share that information with the candidate. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm going to hire the candidate. With the right candidate, the person I hire, I'm, you know, the very first day, I'm going to tell them, okay, this is the biggest concern. This is where we need you to make the biggest impact. But unless you ask the question correctly, kind of what I want to say, non-confrontational, you know, I'm not going to share that information. So you want to ask, you know, an I-oriented, you know, how can I help with your most, you know, your toughest priorities, or something like that. What was it about my background that you believe can make the most impact here? Now that may or may not solicit a response to their problems, but it has a much better chance than asking a direct question. What are your challenges? What keeps you up at night? I don't like that question at all. Okay, I'm concerned that you don't have as much experience as we'd like in blank. Okay, so that's back to summarizing what their most important priorities. And, you know, it may be that, you know, relative to some of the other experiences you have, that's a little low on the list, but you definitely want to put the answer in the context of all the things that you bring to what they need, and that means you need to know what they need. Oops, went the wrong way. Okay, so here's another, so now we're kind of switching a little bit to a different topic, using effective questioning to respond to difficult questions. And so this is where you use a question to answer a question. And the silent treatment is not a question, but it is a question. It's kind of like, well, you know, what else are you going to tell me? And often occurs after they may have asked you a challenging question, like, you know, you don't have a master's degree, you don't meet our basic requirements, then you may get the silent treatment. So now's the time for a question. Is there anything else I can add to that point, or even did I answer your question? And then for advanced students, would you like to hear about a time I did X, Y, and Z? So now you're going on to talk about a way you can help them out, and by offering to tell a story. We all talked about that. So, but here you go. That's how to deal with the silent treatment. How do you feel about working nights and weekends? Here's another one. I love the answer to this. It's kind of like that question, what does it take to be an outstanding performer? What is your norm for your best people here? And that's asking the question with a question, answering a question with a question. What is the norm for your best people here? Okay, because you definitely want to be one of their best people. And so be curious to you know, do your best people, wait a minute, how many nights a week, how many weekends do they work? It's a good question. It's a good question to ask. Sell me this, whatever, stapler, pen, paper clip. So if you're a salesperson, you're going to get this question. And so now this is where questions can be used to discover what they want in their stapler or their pen or, you know, their paper clip. And salespeople know that have been trained to do this, you know, ask questions, find out what the client is buying. And so now you get a chance to work that out. If you're in sales, you know, don't skip this step. Be prepared for these off the wall, you know, sell them something by asking them good questions. Here's another one, the salary question. You know, one of the first things you can do after talking a little bit about your research is ask for the salary range of the position before you give your answer or in lieu of answering the question. And this is obviously more complicated than just this simple thing, but it's another example of how asking a question can move the ball forward without you actually answering the question. Okay, I want to share, do we have time? Yeah, we have time. So there's two questions here, and I'm going to actually switch over and I want to show you the document and talk about this, how to handle the illegal question. Okay, and one of the statements in that document is, remember that the illegal questions rise from fear that you won't perform. Okay, but let me bring this up.
Yes.
Okay, illegal questions include anything regarding your age, your children, or other dependents, your marital status, your maiden name, your religion, your political affiliation, big long list of illegal questions. So most interviewers know that they are not supposed to ask these questions, but here you go. You may encounter, usually on a second or third interview, a senior executive who doesn't interview much and forgets that they can't ask such questions. And sometimes these questions get asked just because they're trying to build rapport. Hey, you know, what do your kids play sports? Okay, that's kind of, you know, if your kids are big, my kids were big into soccer and my daughter was big into dance. And so I can see myself, you know, in a moment over a meal or something, asking a question, which is not really appropriate, but just curious about, you know, the kinds of activities that their kids in. And so that's kind of how it happens most of the time. So here's how you can handle this illegal question. You can assert your legal right not to answer. That would embarrass, it would be awkward. So not the best idea. You could just go ahead and answer the question straightforwardly if you feel the answer could help you. Okay. So if you happen to know that, like my children question, that if I've already shared with you the activities that my kids are in, you might, you know, want to volunteer yours as well. It's an opportunity to develop rapport. Here's an example, you know, where you could ask about your religious affiliations, and if you're, you know, active in your church and you happen to know that the interviewer is as well, then talking about your church, your religious affiliation could benefit you, so you can take that path. And then here's the best way, is to answer the concern behind the question without answering the question itself. So this is this is probably the best way, right? Is to understand, intuit, what their concern is, and answer that question, not the question that they ask. Okay. Now right here it says, you can answer with a friendly, smiling question of your own on whether there's a concern that your age may affect your performance. Okay. I wouldn't be that direct, but here's a recommendation from this document. Okay. But really what you want to do is reassure the interviewer that there's nothing in this job and you can't do. Okay. In fact, your age and experience are the most important advantages you offer the employer, and give some reasons. And again, this is informed by the answers to those initial questions. What are your top priorities? What was in my background that you believe will make the biggest impact in this role? And then let's go to question 59 is also the opinion question. So one of the reasons I just started distributing this document is this is the only place I've seen where the opinion question is addressed, and how to answer the opinion question. And so it might be, what do you think about abortion, the president, the ruling party, Democrats or Republicans, the death penalty, other controversial subjects. Okay, now what they recommend in here is you kind of pull up a little bit and say, why do you ask? Okay, why do you ask? And that's down here at the bottom of the page. But it's a little more complicated than that, so I wanted to go over this. If you are ever uncomfortable with any question, right there in the middle of the page, asking a question in return is the greatest escape hatch ever invented. And really, you can ask questions really to change the subject, okay? It throws the onus back on the other person, sidetracks the discussion from going into an area of risk to you, and gives you a time to think of your answer, or even better, your next question. Okay. Now, what do you ask may disarm them, but they realize, probably shouldn't be discussing that over dinner with you. But it can also be very awkward. So you may have to fall back on eventually answering the question, or better yet, changing the subject, right? And you do that by feigning, I guess is the right word, disinterest. Okay, so, who's going to win the playoffs, right? So now you don't know who's going to win the basketball playoffs. And now you don't know what their affiliation is. So you really just want to feign, basketball is not my thing. Who do you think is going to win? Who's your favorite? So now you've reversed that and put it back on them. Neutral questions for panel interviews. So one of the things that happens in the pit crew is that inevitably, it happens almost every time, is there's usually 3 interviewers, and so the candidate will say, oh, that's a really good question. Okay, so now you've complimented the panelists that asked you that question, and the other interviewers, it's really kind of funny, the other panelists are start keeping track of how many you got a good questions did they get, and in the end they'll report that to the candidate, and invariably somebody gets left out. So in a panel interview, you don't want to show any favoritism in any way. And so if you've got a question like you need to ask that very neutral. Okay, so it's really difficult in a panel interview to build rapport and to ask personalized questions until and unless you've figured out or already know in advance what their area of focus is. Okay, so until you know this person is a salesperson, or this person is the operations person, or this person is the accounting person, you shouldn't be directing your questions to any one person in particular. You just ask these neutral and not personalized questions. What do you think about? I'm curious to know. Okay, these are questions that can be answered by anybody. It's also telling and helpful to keep track of who answers those kinds of open-ended questions, and then you start to figure out what their area of expertise. Okay. You can also, one of the things I wanted to mention, and I'll mention it here, is that you can use your questions to control the course of the interview. So Walt mentioned this as well. If there's a story that you really want to tell, something that you think is germane, and it hasn't come up, you can go ahead and offer it, you know. So what do you think about using agile techniques for sales forecasts? Okay, it's an interesting concept. Agile, if you guys don't know what agile is, it's usually a way of developing software, okay? But it's much more general than that. And so here's this question, and if you've got some insight, experience, or if you've implemented this before very successfully, you may want to ask a leading question about that. And in the phrase of an academic kind of question, you know, what do you think about using? And they may say, that's kind of curious. And they reverse that question on you. You know, what do you know about that? And then you can tell your story. Okay, so now you've kind of influenced the direction of the interview by asking an insightful question. So would you like to hear about a time that or would you like to hear about how I did X, Y, and Z, how I helped my company save a lot of money? You know, these are ways to get an interview that's flagging going, or to change the direction of the interview by asking questions. Should you practice today? Yes. Then sign up with the pit crew, reach out to his LinkedIn page and get registered for his interview success workshop. Both are good ways to get started. And I think, you know, if you're a little nervous about a practice interview, go to Walt's class and he'll get you better prepared and more confident, and then you can come to the pit crew. And if you're thinking you shouldn't practice, then you need to rethink that, because yes, you should, and you should practice more than once. You can benefit from practicing more than once, and that's the story. More than once for the same position, for the same company even. A lot of people will come and practice for their initial round, and then their second round and their third round, or maybe they'll skip a round and practice for their fourth, but you can come back and practice as many times as you like. We're always open and available to help.
All right, well, that was the presentation. If anybody has any questions, Walt's with us and he can answer any questions that you have. So feel free to unmute your mic and ask away. Anyone have any questions? We posted both those documents are in the chat window. So if you're unable to download it, you're welcome to send me an email and I'll be glad to send you both those documents. They're both also up on the Career USA website. If you go to resources and then videos, you'll be able to find it on that page right there where you can get to it. I
have a question, Jeff.
Yeah, go ahead, Walt.
I would like each person, if they could, to put into the chat window, what's one of the most important things that you picked up from today's presentation? I'd like to get some feedback on where the opinions lie in the value of what you learned today.
What's the most important tip you picked from this? Responding to a question by answering a star story.
Thanks, buddy. Maybe I should ask, what's the least important thing you learned today?
On Facebook, they say questions for recruiters. Just being able to hear some questions that you can ask and how to talk to recruiters. Thank you for joining us on Facebook today. John said, asking what does it take to be an outstanding performer? I think that's a really, really important question if you can ask that towards the beginning of an interview, because then you know what to focus on during the rest of the time you have together. Any other comments or questions anybody has? Karen says to emphasize your desire to request what you can do to be an outstanding, I'm just to be an outstanding employee. Any questions? Anybody else? Last chance. Well, Walt, thank you for being with us today. Let me just share Career DFW and Career USA. We're putting on training 4 days a week. Hopefully you'll join us for upcoming sessions that we have going on. Tomorrow is the 4th Thursday of the month, so we'll be talking about networking, taking the chill out of cold calls. And this is with Bob Marher, who is a certified coach. This Friday at the North Dallas Plano Career Focus Group meeting at 9:30 in the morning, Walt Glass will be with us to talk about informational interviewing. So you go out and you find somebody to talk to. What do you talk to them about once you reach out, and how do you do that? Next Tuesday for LinkedIn Tuesdays, Terry Sullivan will be with us to talk about how to create a LinkedIn brand that tells your key contacts who you are, what you do, and how you can help. Please note that this event next Tuesday will not be recorded. So if you want to watch Terry, you do have to watch him live. Next Wednesday, session number 9, we'll be talking about demonstrating enthusiasm. That really is a big point to make sure if you're enthusiastic, it can make or break you in an interview. So please join us then. And then next Thursday, being the 5th Thursday of the month, instead of doing resumes and networking, I'm going to do a presentation on how to use Career DFW and Career USA in your job search. So it's a special presentation. It's open to everyone, so please join us. That'll be next Thursday at 1 o'clock. This session has been recorded. It will be on the Career DFW Facebook page and the Career USA YouTube channel. On the Career USA YouTube channel, be sure to click the red area where it says playlist, and then down below, pick whatever subject you want, and then click where it says view full playlist, and then up will come all the different topics and titles that happen to be in that particular playlist. The newest event should be on the very top for you to view. If you're not receiving emails about our workshops, you're welcome to join the Career USA mailing list. Just send an email to Career USA, the + subscribe at groups.io. What you'll get is 5 emails a week. 1 email will be the career tip of the week, and the other 4 emails will be about the tip, the topic of the day, the title of the day, and the Zoom link of the day. So that way you don't have to go searching for the Zoom link for our daily webinars. Please remember, Career DFW, we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Walt, Mark, myself, we're all volunteers. We're all here to help you land your next great opportunity. Career DFW survives on donations. Please consider making a donation when you get your next job. So thank you for joining us today. Walt, thank you very much. Everybody else, we'll see you later in the week, we hope.
Thanks, guys.